Hello and welcome to CharitEpulse, your regular update on news and happenings in the charity sector and the podcast where purpose meets personality. I'm James Saunders, partner at Moore Kingston Smith, and I'm joined as ever by my co-hosts Catherine Rostromji, partner and head of charities at Shakespeare Martineau, and Charles Mosquita, charities director at Quilter Cheviot. We're going to dive into the heart of the charity sector, unpack the big issues, spotlight some unsung heroes, and share the stories that matter to you. You may be listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or any of our respective organisations' websites. However you're listening, you're very welcome, but please don't forget to like or follow, subscribe, generally hit any positive buttons you can for us, presuming, of course, you do find our sessions useful. So let's dive in, and the first issue on the agenda this week is the recent government spending review and the impact on the charity sector. Generally, I think very few announcements that affect charities directly, but plenty where, especially across the welfare sector, charities will be interested. Housing, homelessness, health, poverty. There's going to be major investment in, for example, social and affordable housing. That was one of the big announcements. Increases in NHS funding. But on the other hand, a 1.4% cut to DCMS, which is one of those unprotected departments. Although I guess that's better than it being abolished altogether, which was what one of the reports said in advance. And another area where charities are involved, the overseas aid budget's been cut again to a very small amount. Catherine, I'll come to you first. Any thoughts on what you saw from the review and or the subsequent coverage?
Yeah, I learned a new thing last night, which was those in the know, they don't call it the spending review, they call it the SR. So of course I'm down with the kids, so I'll now refer to it purely as the SR. I thought it was interesting really that charities are still so low down on the priority list that yes, there's reference to health and social care, to housing, to welfare and poverty, to the NHS, but I think the government are naive where they seem to think there's not even, it shouldn't even be trickle down, do they? But they think there will be this sharing of if certain sectors get the funding, they will share it with charities. No, they won't, and they don't. So I think it's disappointing that the NHS, to my mind, keeps getting more and more and more funding, and then charities operating in and around the health scene are not treated with the same level of financial support. So, it was interesting. It was useful. It's useful to know the environment, I think, in which charities are working, but I wouldn't say they got much of a help from the latest SR.
No, very good, SR.
Yeah.
I mean, money spent on these these U-turn policies. The pensioners now getting the winter fuel allowance. Clearly, something that the charity sector has lobbied for. New free school meals policies, welcomed, I'm sure, by many in the charity sector. But as we said, the trade-off seems to be in some of the other departments. I mentioned overseas aid in particular, as that's been reduced. Charles, what about you? I noticed that the Charity Commission actually is getting a bit of a bump in its funding, which is one of your pet projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the budget's going to be increased from 29.8 million up to 37.9 million. I think that's partly in response to AI before it falls back to 34.4 million. But what always amuses me that I remember, and I did go back and check my facts, is that in 2005-06, that the Charity Commission budget at that time was 32.9 million. Now, if you index link that to today, that would be 57 million. So actually, they've had a significant cut over the years. And the number of charities they were regulating back in 2005-06 was 190,000. Today, it's 170,000. So still a significant number. Interestingly, again, the income in 2005-06 from total charities was about 38 billion, which if you index link that, it gets to 65 billion, where today, actually, the income that's being spent by the sector is closer to 96 billion, according to the Charity Commission. So, I think for a long time they have had a lot of austerity. So this uplift, which you know, in the scheme of things, is relatively small in governmental expenditure, but I suspect is extremely well deserved. The other two things I noticed is one, the SR, the total departmental spend, is going to increase by 2.3% in real terms. So that to me means that the annual expenditure is going to be going up by 4 to 6%, depending on whether you think inflation is 2 or 3 or even 4%. At the moment, it's about 3.5%. And the final thing I'll say is that Catherine and I attended a seminar, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago with Deborah Alcock-Tyler from the Directory of Social Change. And we all know government funding is tight. And we all know that they've said there's no more money. But her message to the charity sector was, particularly with local authorities and government, is don't take no for an answer. If you feel that you've got a justified cause and it needs to be funded, there is always money there. It's just making what you do a priority. So I think people shouldn't necessarily be downhearted by what it is. But like everything else, this is not an easy there's not an awful lot of money around, but there is still money around.
Well, and the pot, of course, will depend on taxes, which I think there's a general acceptance that they're very likely to go up in the autumn. I mean, there is still increases for the NHS, substantial increases for the NHS in this recent spending review, and on defence, which was well trailed. There was an interesting increase for local government, which is another area that works with a charity sector an awful lot, or charity sector works with an awful lot, and an area that has had an awful lot of challenges recently. Lots of local government bodies deciding that they can't do what they're supposed to do, declaring themselves out of business, taking back services, or that sort of thing. But it is a difficult area to try and work through. Catherine, have you got any more thoughts about particularly that local government increase and whether that will make an impact on the charity sector?
I think it might, but I think it's Charles's point actually, and I thought that was really interesting when Deborah Alcock-Tyler mentioned this in terms of not. Yes, there's a point of kind of lobbying and asking for more, but there's also a point of if charities are being squeezed based on a contract they've already entered into and the circumstances have changed, then the charities should be negotiating back to say, that's fine, but now we've had a 20% real terms cut, so we'll be delivering 20% less of the contract that we agreed, rather than we'll still do the full 100 and just soak it all up, which I think is the default for charities. So I think there's a piece around that.
Charles?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that Deborah made the point was that charities shouldn't just absorb the cuts. You know, they're going to have to push back. They can't just keep on finding resources elsewhere. And that's a really difficult thing to do, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be hurt by any cuts is your beneficiaries, and you don't want that to happen. But also, you know, there is a balance here. And I think the problem is with the sector has had for a very long time is it accepts the cuts and it then absorbs that, rather than saying, hold a second here, this is your statutory obligation. You need to fund this properly.
Okay. Right. Thanks. Some good insights into the SR. Second this week, according to a new report by UK Grant Making, very interesting insights into the grant sector. Trusts and foundations, the group that's called Trusts and Foundations by account, have overtaken government bodies as the largest source of grant income to the charity sector. Government remains the biggest provider of contract income, but particularly on grant income, it's just been that slight rebalance between the independent organisations and government. Catherine, did you have any thoughts on this about where the money comes from, if you like, that supports the sector?
Yeah, I was trying not to automatically poo-poo it. They'd done a colourful diagram with lots of bubbles of representing the size and scale of all of this. But I think the key finding that they mentioned actually at the start was that over 14,000 UK grant makers provided grants worth over £23 billion in 23-24, and that this represents an increase of 7%, which is slightly above inflation. think where it then gets challenging is when you try and take 14,000 grant makers and then allocate them into different groups, then I would take issue with some of the categorization. So the fact that trusts and foundations are separately shown other than charity, whereas one of those trusts and foundations is Wellcome Trust, which is a charity, and there will be others within that particular bubble that are charities. There's also reference to donor advised funds as other rather than as charity. So again, I just thought, I mean, it is interesting, though, I think it's fascinating to understand that more in terms of where charitable giving actually comes from in the UK and where the majority of that lies. I just thought there was a bit of, you need to look at it and consider it, I think, a bit more obviously than just looking at the coloured bubbles, which did look lovely, but I just thought there should be different sizes.
But in your experience of the last year, couple of years or so, does it feel like government is giving less comparatively than private individuals, trusts and foundations? I mean, we've said for some time that, almost since COVID really, that the government funding was going to reduce and that trusts and foundations were going to have to step into the gap. This seems to me to be bearing that out. Does that make sense?
A little bit. I mean, it feels like government is giving less, but I think it's more the nature of how they give. I don't think they give a pot of money and say, do something lovely with it. I think now they give a contract and they say, do these
Yeah.
specific things and we give you this money. So I think it's more the nature of how government is funding the sector, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. But I do also think that we probably underappreciate others that are financing the charity sector and that don't have an easy ride of it, actually. I mean, I set up a number of grant making charities with the Charity Commission who do not make it easy. So, I think we should be applauding, those that are going out of their way to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Charles, this same report tells us that donor advised funds, as Catherine referred to earlier, the donor advised funds increased grant making by 20% to 2.1 billion this year. Clearly a growing part of the sector and the sector's income. Can you give us a little explainer about this, just the basics of what donor advised funds are, as I know you're a trustee of one. It seems to be a great success story.
Yeah, proud trustee. In fact, Prism the Gift Fund has got its 20th anniversary this year, and it's, I think, 75th largest charity, probably the most unknown in the UK, which is extraordinary. So donor advice funds, I mean, it's a ghastly name. It came out from the US, I think in the 1920s was the first one. I don't actually think they were formalized. And effectively what they are enabling individuals is, rather than setting up their own charity, they can effectively do it through a donor advice fund, which acts as an umbrella. It's a charity in its own right. And underneath the umbrella, you've got these different spokes of which you can have your own fund. The great thing about donor advice funds is that one, you can set them up immediately. You don't have to go to the Charity Commission to get permission. And Catherine will talk about how you can do that if you want to set up your own. And it's a word the Americans again use, is about enhanced advisory. So once you've given the money into the charity, it then becomes the responsibility of the trustees of how you spend it. But however, as trustees, for this to work, we will listen to whoever the settlor is about what they want to do with the money while it sits within the donor advice and who they distribute it. So as a trustee, I'm not making any judgment on where somebody wants to give money away to, so long as it falls within charitable law and that it is for public benefit. So, for example, and I'm quite happy, but maybe I don't particularly, I'm not a great fan of cats. Somebody wants to give money to cats. That doesn't matter, because again, a donor advice fund has complete ability to be able to give anything away to anything, so long as it is charitable, but it is very much so being driven by the individuals. And again, so, this is a really simple, easy, convenient way. And anybody that has, I mean, you could debate it, but less than 5 million or 10 million that they want to give to charity, probably should look at a donor advice fund. I mean, our largest one, I think, is about 30 or 40 million. And the reason is the guy started quite relatively small, but actually he loves the convenience of it. He loves the ability that he has no responsibility, or the family has no responsibility from a legal point of view. That sits with us, with the trustees, but he has all the fun of giving that money away and directing of how it is utilized.
Okay, yeah, that's useful. Thank you. And Charles, what about the wider question around this grant making sector? Does it, these stats, do they chime with what you've been seeing in the last couple of years?
Yeah, so the two things, going back to Catherine's point around, trusts and foundations have overtaken government bodies. That to me is just a different way of government distributing money to the sector and doing it on a contractual basis. I don't necessarily think, I mean, there are a lot of circumstances where that is the right way to do it, but it does increase the bureaucratic burden on both sides, where grant making, I think, was a much simpler way of doing it. And I'm not sure whether there's been any conversation about when should something be given as a grant and when should it be a contract. And I think that could be an interesting thing, because I do worry that, we're looking, when government and local authorities are giving money away, they're doing it on an annual basis, because that's how the Treasury works. And that's not necessarily a very efficient way of actually doing it. So you're increasing the cost, so we could reduce that. And the other thing I noticed is that endowment levels have remained relatively flat over the past 5 years. Now, that I assume they're talking about is their investments that generate the money for them to distribute away, which represents a decline in real terms since 2020, 2021. Well, actually, over the last 5 years, the returns that you would have expected would be somewhere in the region of about 30%. So I thought that was quite interesting in the respect that the actual level of the endowment seemed to have remained flat. Now, whether that has something to do with some of them spending out, I don't know. Again, like all these things, these are headlines. You need to lift the bonnet, look behind it, and try and get them to understand what the figures mean.
Okay, good. Thanks very much. Third one to turn to, Sarah Hughes, the CEO of Mind, wrote an interesting piece this week asking about particularly this civil society covenant, which has come into play with the new government. Catherine, any particular thoughts on this? It struck me there was an interesting point about being political but not party political, which is an interesting dynamic, I think, and clearly opens the door, as we've discussed before, to being accused by various parties of being party political, regardless of your intent on political issues. That was one of the things that struck me out of this article, and it was a difficult one. Anything else particularly for you that you found interesting?
Yeah, and I think it is interesting. I think charities actually had moved too far back from anything that might be deemed to be political, thinking we're not allowed to do that. And actually, Charity Commission guidance has always been clear on that. Charities can campaign, where in doing so, they're furthering their objects and they're not being party political. So yes, they can campaign. So I think it's useful to see that in its sense. Again, the presentation last night I was at was talking about the covenant being co-created and co-produced by, yes, DCMS, but also with those in the sector, and that is due to be published in the summer. But the acknowledgement there being that whenever it's seasonal, who knows how long those seasons might last. But I think it'll be interesting to see the detail of it. But I did think there's some really useful points in the article, interesting to see the way that these things translate and to hear the observations from a charity chief exec. Personally, I hated the tent analogy, so people will have to go up and look at the article to find out what the tent was. I think it's just I don't like tents. So, interesting, I think, just to challenge, and again, for charities maybe to push back on, we're not just going to take it, and if government is wrong, any government is wrong, we need to be explaining that. But I suppose there is that piece about you can be political, but can you do it politely, would be the Charity Commission's plea, rather than being obnoxious.
There was a point in there about a dilemma around compromises in particular. The charities, the article says, can negotiate and can compromise. but the beneficiaries can't. And there's very little room for negotiation around benefit levels and income levels, that sort of thing. Charles, what about you? Did anything in here particularly flag any red flags to you?
I mean, the thing that sort of shouted out at me is that this needs to be a cross-party agreement, because otherwise we're going to have, I mean, Keir Starmer is clearly very much behind this and driving this about having a civil society covenant. And I think it's absolutely right that we should have one. But this needs to be agreed across all parties, and this is something that needs to stay there. We need to recognise the importance of the sector. We need to recognise the amazing work that they do. And there needs to be some sort of consistency. I mean, I did quite like the tent analogy, but I like this. I like this idea of the sector being a tapestry and that every thread matters, and that to me was a wonderful picture of what it does. But you do have natural tensions within there because you feel passionate about whatever cause you're involved with. You want people to make change, and you feel that should be front and center. Politicians always say that they want people to speak truth to power, but my impression is that really they don't want to listen necessarily to that. Maybe I'm being a little bit unfair. But yes, at the end of the day, you do have to compromise, and so there is that need to remain independent, but also be inside the tent of where you're actually party to that conversation and guiding and being realistic about what you can achieve. And I sometimes think we don't focus on, perhaps I'm a bit too common sense and practical of, what is it we can do? Where can we really make a thing, rather than looking at it from an idealistic point of view of saying, I want the world to be perfect, and I'm just accepting the world ain't perfect, and how can we have it on a trajectory of improvement rather than trying to have everything all at the same time. So yeah, that was mine. I thought it was a really interesting article. It was very thought-provoking, and I think very clearly articulated, even if some people didn't like some of the analogies.
Okay, thanks for that. That last point, just recently released this last weekend, were the King's Birthday Honours. I think it's worth saying there were a huge number of charity sector individuals amongst the 1,200 or so award recipients. Not many, unfortunately, make the national press. It's invariably Sir Beckham and various other entertainment luminaries that get the BBC headlines, but there were some really rewarding and some very nice mentions of people through the charity press of our sector bodies and sector representatives getting awards. Anyone particularly catch your eye, Charles?
No, but I've got a plea actually that people listening to this podcast, if they would like us to profile somebody who's got an award and the reasons behind it, we'd be very happy to hear from them. We should definitely celebrate those that have got the awards. I have to say I didn't spot many people that I knew on the list, but that's not necessarily hugely surprising.
It seemed to me that the people on the list had done a lot more than the hosts of Strictly. I particularly liked there was Richard Kramer, who is the former chief exec of Sense, and he was given an OBE, and he said it reflects the hard work and dedication of so many staff, colleagues and volunteers that I have been so lucky to work and volunteer with over 40 years in the disability sector. I mean, I know it feels like Strictly is on the 59th season and it's been going for hundreds of years, but yeah, I just thought, again, it doesn't get picked up in the national press, and I thought there's huge effort and selflessness that people put in, and all credit to them, and well done.
So we'll shout about it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps not quite so much glamour, but very much rewarding. And I'll just have a shout to Robin Osterley at Charity Retail Association, who's my client, and great charity. I've mentioned him before, great charity, and he got an OBE. So for his work, particularly in the charity sector, and there's plenty on the list who also deserve a mention, as Charles suggested. Good. That is, I think, probably all we've got time for this week. We've covered an awful lot there. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Charles, and thank you to the listener for tuning into this episode of Charity Pulse. We hope today's conversation offered some insight and some inspiration, and hopefully a bit of a better understanding of some aspects of this most important world of charity and social impact. Got any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please do let us know. Whether you're a charity professional or a passionate volunteer or simply someone who cares about making a difference, we do aim to ensure that there's something here for you. Don't forget, please, to follow us and leave us a review, share our podcast with your network, get in touch, and do join us next time as we continue to explore the challenges and the opportunities facing charities, non-profits, voluntary organisations. Thanks so much. Bye-bye for now.